So, after talking about these three skills that artists have, now let's discuss the connection between artists and regular folks. Regular people become artists through artists. When it comes down to it, the main purpose of making art is to express our life experiences in tangible form. In simple terms, that's what it's all about. Turning experiences into form means turning emotions into tangible form. This urge and need is present in everyone. When we're caught up in a certain emotion, we're trapped and controlled by it, and we don't have the freedom to deal with our own feelings. How do we get freedom from our own emotions? By turning those emotions into tangible form that we can sense and understand. That way, we can take control over our own emotions that have power over us. The spark that kicks off art creation comes from deep within us. We all feel that urge, but let's face it, it's pretty darn hard. Turning our feelings into tangible form, capturing experiences in form, it's a tough nut to crack for us regular folks. We struggle to create form that really convey our experiences, so we often have to lean on artists to help us out. This need for artistic expression creates a natural connection between us and the artists. When I say us, I mean regular folks who find it tough to make this transformation on our own but really want to. We realize that we can't quite pull it off, but then we see how artists can. As a result, we form this kind of bond with artists, showing that we're not so different from them after all. We just want to achieve something that's a bit out of our grasp, but they've got it down. That's why we naturally rely on artists to bring their unique perspective and skills to the table. So, let's talk about the connection between artists and us. Let's take poetry, for example. When we read a poem and it brings us pleasure, what kind of pleasure is it? Is it like, wow, that's really artistic, or just plain old enjoyment of the art? And did we really pick up on the poet's personal vibes through their poem? When we read a poem by Du Fu, where does our joy come from? It's from getting what Du Fu was feeling when he penned the poem. But is our joy directly tied to that? Not really. The poet's emotions at the time don't really have much to do with us, unless we're those studious types who analyze Du Fu's poem and somehow manage to suss out the emotions he had when he wrote it. But that's not really appreciating the poem. The pleasure and feels that the poem stirs in us don't necessarily come from vibing with the poet's emotions, no way. That's just not what's happening. So, am I listening to Beethoven to get on his level emotionally when he wrote a piece? Who knows? Beethoven definitely cooked up his compositions from his own feels, no doubt about that. But after he finished, the piece spoke way more than just the emotions that drove him. And then he'd just be there, staring at his masterpiece. When we dig a poet's poem, we're basically using the poet's words to let out our own emotions. The pleasure comes from that, getting in touch with our own feels that we couldn't quite get out before. It's like, we just happened to read this poem, and it suddenly gives voice to all the stuff we've kept bottled up. And at that moment, the poem moves us, giving us that awesome high of art appreciation. Oh, those guys from the Lake Poets, you know, Samuel Coleridge said something really classic. So, this poet from the English Lake District, Coleridge, said that we can tell someone is a poet because he's the one who turns us into poets. He uses his poetry to turn us into poets, so that's how we know he's a real poet. He uses his poetry to bring out the poet in us. We know he's pouring out his emotions. How do we know this, you ask? Well, it's because he helps us express our own feelings. It's a pretty classic line, if you ask me. We can tell that Du Fu is pouring out his emotions, right? How do we know? Because Du Fu helps us express our own emotions through his poetry. That's how we know Du Fu is really expressing himself. In old China, there is a similar saying, that someone is a poet is because he transforms us into poets with his poetry. Whether the story circulating in China is true or not, it kind of makes sense. Didn't Li Bai, 8th century CE, also climb the Yellow Crane Tower? Yeah, he did. He climbed the Yellow Crane Tower. Wasn't he moved, just moved by the vast vista in front of him, and then he felt the urge to write poetry. His emotions just welled up inside him. And can you believe it, when he looked up, he saw a poem on the wall. Chui Hao's, 8th century CE, poem was there, you know. Now, what did Chui Hao's poem say at that time? People of old have flown away on the yellow crane, the tower here is now empty. Once the yellow crane has gone, it does not return, the white clouds drift on for 1,000 ages. The crystal-clear river reflects the Han Yang trees, the fragrant reeds grow on Parrot Isle. From the setting sun, where can I find my hometown's gate? Misty ripples make people melancholy. So, what did Li Bai write after reading this poem? Chui Hao's poem silenced Li Bai, unless Li Bai, when he climbed the Yellow Crane Tower, faced a different kind of natural scenery that brought out a different set of emotions. Afterward, he realized that all the emotions he wanted to express were already in Chui Hao's poetry. It was the same emotions he felt. At that moment, we can't really say Li Bai is the poet, we have to say that in that moment, Chui Hao turned Li Bai into a poet. You know, it's often the case, especially after the peak of Chinese poetry, when Tang and Song poems were all the rage, things kind of went downhill. I mean, reading poetry from the Qing dynasty just doesn't have the same kick. It's like the golden age has passed. So, why do we still feel the need to write poetry? Well, it's like we have to, you know? We Chinese express our life feelings using language, and poetry is the way we do it. You want to express yourself, but those Tang and Song poems are already out there. Let me tell you about this trip I took with a good friend and colleague back in the 1980s. We went to Hangzhou and had a blast. Nowadays, traveling is no big deal, but back then, it was a big deal for us. We made sure to visit the Shilin Seal Art Society. Before we left, I told my friend that we had to write poetry when we got there, and he was totally on board. So, when we finally got to the Shilin Society, it was twilight, the surroundings were vast, and the sun was setting in the west. We stood on this not-so-high pavilion, taking it all in, and I felt this urge to write poetry. I told my friend, let's write some poetry now. He was like, sure. But I was struggling to get started. Then out of the blue, he started reciting, Sunset on the Tower, the sound of geese fleeting across, a southern traveler. The Wu sword, striking the railings, no one can say, the meaning of our ascent. It just flowed out of him. I found out it was by Xin Qiji, and it really resonated with me at that moment. I was young, with unfulfilled dreams, feeling a bit lonely, and facing this vast twilight, the urge to write just bubbled up. But then I thought, nah, Xin Qiji nailed it. We were southern travelers, you know. We heard the birds' cries, geese crossing, a southern traveler. It was sunset on the tower. The sound of geese crossing, a southern traveler, watching the Wu sword, that weapon. Striking the railings, that feeling of unfulfilled aspiration. No one understands, who knows, who understands our loneliness, the sense of unfulfilled aspiration and loneliness. No one can say the meaning of the ascent. He finished reciting, and I was like, I got nothing. So, he was right, I didn't have to force it. Why bother, right? Just memorize more Tang and Song poems. The future of Chinese poetry is all about modern and vernacular poetry. If you try to write poetry using the structured format of classical poetry, it's like your mouth has been shut, they've already reached their peak. What Tang poetry couldn't express, song-style poetry took over, you know. That's when the lyric genre of the Song dynasty in Chinese poetry came about. If lyrics couldn't cut it, could you turn to Yuan opera? I don't think so. It's better to turn to music. Lyrics have really pushed Chinese poetry to its peak. That's why you need Tang poems and song lyrics in your head. Artists are artists, poets are poets, because they turn us into poets with their works. Let's take a breather.